In the summer of 1943, the Pacific was a vast battlefield of scattered islands, dense jungle, and restless seas. The United States Navy was pushing slowly north through the Solomon Islands, island by island, trying to break Japan's defensive ring. Among the ships moving through those waters was the destroyer USS Strong, a fast, thin-hulled warship with a crew of more than 200 men and a single mission: protect the fleet and hit the enemy before being hit themselves. Serving on board was a 30-something lieutenant from Alabama named Hugh Barr Miller Jr. He had studied engineering before the war and joined the Navy as an officer candidate when America entered the fight. He was calm, analytical, and quiet, the kind of man who didn't seek attention but earned respect through competence. His shipmates called him Hugh B. On the night of July 5th, 1943, the Strong was part of a small American task force covering landings near New Georgia. The crew had been at general quarters for hours. The air was still and black, broken only by the faint glow of cigarettes hidden behind cupped hands. At 1100 hours, radar operators picked up movement, an enemy formation to the north, perhaps destroyers laying mines. The Strong was ordered to investigate. No one saw the torpedo that changed everything. It came from nearly 6 miles away, a long-range shot fired by a Japanese destroyer. At 11:19 hours, the torpedo slammed into the Strong's port side near the engine room. The blast ripped through the hull, blew men overboard, and killed dozens instantly. Within minutes, the ship began to list heavily. Lieutenant Miller was thrown against a bulkhead. The lights flickered out, replaced by the red glow of emergency lamps. Orders echoed through the smoke. Abandon ship. He helped wounded men to the deck, guided others into the dark sea, then jumped himself just before the destroyer rolled onto her side and sank beneath the waves. The explosion had been so violent that debris rained down across the water. Miller surfaced amid oil and burning wreckage, clutching a floating piece of wood. The night was alive with shouts, the hiss of steam, and the crack of small arms ammunition cooking off below the surface. He gathered a few survivors, tying them together with a line, and they began the slow drift toward the faint outline of Kolombangara Island, several miles away. Sharks prowled nearby. Miller could see the thin dorsal fins slicing through the moonlit water. He kicked quietly, pulling wounded men toward a floating raft that had drifted loose from the ship. Hours passed. One by one, the voices around him grew weaker. By dawn, only a handful remained. When the sun rose on July 6th, the survivors saw jungle-covered land, but it might as well have been another planet. Kolombangara was held by Japanese troops, heavily fortified, with small patrols moving along the beaches. Reaching it meant possible capture or death, yet the alternative was certain drowning. Miller and 4 others decided to risk it. Using the raft as a shield, they paddled with broken boards toward a narrow cove. The surf slammed them against coral and threw them onto the sand. Exhausted, they crawled into the shade of the jungle. 2 men died within hours from their injuries. Miller, badly bruised and concussed, buried them beneath palm leaves. He took stock of what remained: 1 canteen half full of seawater, a few scraps of food, and a pistol. No radio, no flares, no hope of rescue. That night, as rain pounded through the canopy, Miller listened to the distant rumble of naval gunfire. The war was still raging only a few miles offshore. Yet here he was, alone, wounded, stranded behind enemy lines. He decided he would not simply wait to die. He began moving inland at dawn, following a small stream to find fresh water. The jungle was alive with noise: birds, insects, the splash of something unseen sliding into the water. He tore his shirt into strips to bind a deep cut on his leg. Each step sent pain shooting through his side, where shrapnel had lodged, but he kept walking until he found a small clearing and built a shelter of branches. Over the next days, he lived on coconuts and whatever fruit he could reach. At night, he could see the faint glow of fires along the beach where Japanese patrols moved. Once, he heard voices only yards away and pressed himself into the mud until they passed. His thoughts turned constantly to the men he'd lost, the ship sinking, and the possibility that American forces might return. After nearly a week, he spotted something unexpected. A Japanese landing craft grounded on a sandbar, guarded by 3 soldiers. They seemed relaxed, unaware that an injured American was watching from the trees. Hunger and desperation overruled fear. Waiting until they slept, Miller crawled forward, seized a rifle, and opened fire. 2 soldiers fell instantly. The third fled into the dark. Miller took their rations, canteens, and a map before disappearing back into the jungle. The attack drew more patrols. For the next several nights, he heard shots echoing through the trees as the Japanese searched. He moved constantly, sleeping in shallow pits he dug himself, eating sparingly from captured supplies. His wounds began to fester. Fever came and went. He spoke aloud sometimes just to hear a human voice. What kept him moving, he later said, was a stubborn belief that someone would come, that the Navy would not leave a man behind. 2 weeks passed. Then one evening he saw distant shapes offshore, American destroyers shelling the island. Using a signal mirror scavenged from debris, he tried flashing toward the ships. Nothing. The next night he built a fire on the beach, small and shielded, but again no one saw. The Navy had no reason to expect survivors here. Still, he refused to give up. He began keeping notes in a small waterproof bag he'd found, recording each day's events, drawing rough maps marking where enemy patrols moved. If he died, he wanted someone to know what had happened. One morning he stumbled upon the wreck of a downed Japanese plane, half hidden in vines. Inside were a few intact emergency rations and a flask of rice wine. The food gave him strength. The alcohol helped clean his wounds. He set simple traps around his camp and caught small birds, roasting them over a tiny flame. After nearly 3 weeks alone, Miller decided to take greater risks. At night, he crept close to a Japanese outpost near the coast, watching the soldiers move in and out. He began striking quickly, stealing supplies, cutting telephone wires, even ambushing isolated guards. The enemy, believing partisans or local scouts were operating nearby, intensified their search. For Miller, it was both survival and revenge. He later admitted he wasn't sure how many days had passed. Time had dissolved into a blur of fear and exhaustion. What mattered was staying alive long enough to be found. Then, on the 27th day since the Strong sank, he heard a distant drone, the sound of aircraft. Crawling to a ridge, he saw American planes bombing the far side of the island. He used smoke from a small signal fire to attract attention, waving a white scrap of cloth. One plane dipped its wings in acknowledgement before turning back toward the sea. The rescue crew could hardly believe what they were hearing. They had been operating off Kolombangara for days, rescuing downed pilots and scouting enemy positions. But they never expected to find a single man who had survived nearly a month alone on a Japanese-held island. When Miller was brought aboard the PT boat, the medics immediately started cleaning his wounds and giving him small sips of water. His skin was sunburned, his beard was grown in, and his eyes looked hollow but focused. The boat's commander, still unsure who he was, asked him to identify himself. Miller repeated, "Lieutenant Hugh Barr Miller, United States Navy, USS Strong." Back at the American base on Rendova, doctors confirmed his identity. His survival was almost impossible to comprehend. Out of more than 200 men aboard the Strong, only about 40 had survived the initial sinking, and most of those had already been rescued or confirmed dead. Miller was presumed lost weeks earlier. Yet here he was, alive and with an unbelievable story to tell. For several days he was treated for dehydration, infection, and fever. He drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes waking in panic, unsure whether the sounds of engines outside were friend or enemy. When he regained enough strength to talk, he gave a full account to Navy intelligence officers. They listened as he described the sinking, the days drifting at sea, the burial of his crewmates, and the long ordeal on Kolombangara. His notes, still preserved in the waterproof bag, matched his story in every detail. The officers were astonished, not only by his endurance, but by his actions during those weeks. He had gathered intelligence on Japanese patrol routes, documented coastal defenses, and even disrupted enemy communications. One admiral reportedly said that Miller had done the work of a small reconnaissance unit, entirely on his own. When he was strong enough, he was flown to a hospital in Noumea for further recovery. The nurses remembered him as quiet, polite, and reluctant to talk about what he'd gone through. To Miller, survival wasn't a story to boast about. It was simply something he had done because there was no other choice. He wrote a letter to the families of the men who had died on the Strong, describing their courage and assuring them that they hadn't suffered. He also asked that those who didn't make it be remembered properly. His own memory of the night of the sinking never faded. The sea was full of fire and voices, he said later, and then, after a while, there was only the sea. For his actions and endurance, Lieutenant Hugh Barr Miller, Jr. was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in the United States Navy. The citation noted his extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty, and described how he had survived alone behind enemy lines for over a month while gathering valuable intelligence and resisting capture. His story circulated quietly through the fleet. To many sailors, it became a legend, proof that even in the most hopeless situations, determination and training could keep a man alive. After months of recovery, Miller returned briefly to the United States. He was still limping, the shrapnel scars across his side visible under his uniform. The Navy offered him a desk job, but he declined. "I want to be useful," he said. He returned to limited duty before the war's end, though his health never fully recovered. When the war finally ended in 1945, he went home to Alabama. Friends said he had changed, quieter, more introspective, often walking alone near the river. He rarely talked about the island or the men he lost. When asked how he survived, he would simply shrug and say, "I just kept moving." In later years, his story appeared in military magazines and brief Navy publications, but it never received the widespread fame it deserved. Hollywood occasionally dramatized tales like his, yet Miller himself never sought attention. He said the real heroes were the ones who didn't make it home. He lived a modest life after the war, working as an engineer and occasionally speaking to veteran groups. He died in 1978, largely unknown to the general public, but still remembered by those who served with him. His Navy Cross remains one of the rare awards given for a combination of survival, courage, and intelligence work under such extreme conditions. Today, his name appears on the Rolls of Valor, a quiet entry among thousands of others who risked everything in the Pacific. Yet his story endures as one of the most remarkable examples of endurance and willpower in World War II. The sea that nearly took his life became a symbol of both loss and resilience. In the years that followed, survivors of other sinkings would quote his example, that no matter how hopeless it seemed, a man could still fight, survive, and hold on to his humanity. Lieutenant Hugh Barr Miller, Jr. never considered himself a hero. In interviews, he downplayed what he had done. But the records and testimonies of those who met him tell a different story. A man who, alone and wounded, refused to surrender to fear. The USS Strong was long gone, and most of its crew had perished. Yet, through Miller's survival, their memory lived on. His endurance proved something larger than one man's courage. It showed that even in the most merciless corners of war, determination could defy fate. As historians piece together the events of that July night, They recognized how improbable his survival had been. A torpedo hit at 6 miles range was rare. The odds of escaping a destroyer that sank in minutes were lower still. Surviving nearly a month in enemy territory, injured and hunted, bordered on the impossible. Yet he did it, step by painful step, guided by instinct and a quiet belief that his story wasn't meant to end there. If you made it this far into the story, please consider subscribing. It helps us share more true stories like this one.